class, we will discuss an exercise on investment appraisal. Let's try to understand something about the problem. We have a company that realizes necklaces, and we know that this company is facing some problems because the market share is very reduced with respect to that of competitors, and at the same time production costs are higher with respect to competitors. Specifically, we have this data. We know that the necklace market is of 50,000 units per year, and then we know that given this amount of units, the company owns the 8% of this market. Then we know that the unitary price of the product is 700 euros per unit, and the production cost is of 200 euros per unit. Given this data, the company decides to identify an investment plan on 2 different steps in order to improve both the revenues, but at the same time to reduce the costs. Specifically, we know that the company plans to have an investment in product redesign that is expected to occur at the year 0, so today, and the amount of this investment is of 400,000 euros. And given this investment in product redesign, the company is expecting an increasing in the market share that is expected to arrive at the 12%, and at the same time, there is an expectation of reducing the unitary cost of 15 euros per unit. Then the company is also planning a second investment that is expected to occur at year number 2 in a new machine, and the amount of money that is related to the acquisition of the new machine is of 2.5 million euros. This machine is expected to have a useful life of 5 years. Because of this investment, we know that the unitary production costs are expected to be reduced by 30 euros per unit. All of these investments are planned thanks to the support which is provided by a consulting company, and also the consulting company should be paid. And the amount that is paid to the consulting company is of 300,000 euros that are expected to be paid at the year number 3. This is our starting point, and the problem is it convenient for our company to invest both in the product redesign and in the new machine? We can answer this question by analyzing if the investment is convenient, which means that we need to apply the NPV over a time horizon of 7 years, and then we need to understand if the NPV at the end of the time horizon is positive or negative. Why on a time horizon of 7 years? Because we have that the product redesign has an impact on the first 2 years, while the investment in the new machine has an impact in the remaining 5 years. Given this data, our starting point should be to identify the cash in and the cash outflows that occur over the 7 years that we have. Specifically, we can start from a table that synthesizes basically everything, identifying the amount of the investments, the variation in the revenues, and then the variation in the costs. Remember that all of the data should be considered by adopting an incremental logic, so we do not need to evaluate the overall amount of the revenues and the overall amount of the costs, but we need to identify this incremental logic. So let's start from something which is simple, and this simplicity is represented by the cash outflows because of the investment. We know that the company invests both in product redesign and also in the new machine. So we have the following cash outflows because of the investments. We have a cash outflows of 400,000 euros that is expected to occur at the year 0, which is related to the product redesign, and this is the first data that we have. Then we have a second cash outflow because of the investment in the new machine, which is of 2.5 million euros, and then we have a cash outflow of 300,000 euros that is related to the payment of this consulting company. So basically we have these 3 different cash outflows that are related to our initial investments. Pay attention that in the table that we are filling in, we are providing data in 1,000 euros. Once we have identified the amount of the investments, we can now move to calculating the variation in the revenues and then the variation in the costs. Let's start by calculating the variation in the revenues. We are talking about variation because we need to adopt an incremental logic. Once we need to identify this variation in the revenue, we need to keep in mind that when we are evaluating investment, we need always to identify a base case. By looking at the data that we have, we can see that the investment is not mandatory for the company, which means that we can also include the possibility for the company to not invest, which means that our reference case is represented by not to implement this investment. In order to identify the variation in the revenues, we can calculate the revenues in the reference case, so without the investment, then the amount of the revenues in the moment in which the company decides to invest, and then the variation. The revenues that is related to this variation is the one that we can take into account in the moment in which we want to define the NPV. Let's start from the calculation of the revenues in the base case. We have some data, so we can use this data to calculate the amount of revenues that we have in the base case. The revenue is calculated as the price multiplied by the quantity. The price is something that we know because we know that the company has a selling price of its product of 700 euros per unit. We need to identify the quantity. We know that the overall market is of 50,000 units. And we know that the company owns the 8% of this amount of the market. Because of this, we can identify the number of units that the company is able to sell every year. And if we multiply this, we obtain 4,000 units, which is the quantity that the company sells without the investment. Now we can do the same, so we can calculate the quantity in the moment in which the company decides to do the investment. And this is because we know that from the text that in the moment in which the company decides to invest, the market share moves from 8% to 12%. So we can calculate again the quantity related to the moment in which the company invests. So if we multiply the overall market, which is of 50,000 units, by 12%, we can identify the number of units that the company is able to sell in the moment in which decides to invest. So we have 6,000 units. As we can see, we have that without the investment, the company is able to sell 4,000 units, while with the investment, the company can sell 6,000 units. Remember that we need to adopt an incremental logic, so we do not care about the overall amount, but we take into account the difference. So the difference between 6,000 units and then 4,000. So the additional units that the company is able to sell because of the investment is represented by 2,000 units. Given this amount, we can now calculate the variation in the revenue. So we can have our delta revenue that will be equal to the price, which is 700 euros per unit, multiplied by the additional quantity that the company is able to sell with the investment, which is 2,000 units. So this value is 1,400,000 euros. And this represents the additional revenue that the company is able to achieve for all of the years of the investment. Of course, this is an additional revenue because this is just a revenue related to the additional quantity that the company is able to sell because of the investment. We can now do the same and calculate the variation in the costs. And we need to distinguish between what happens in the year number 1 and in the year number 2 because of the production redesign, and then what occurs from the year number 3 to the year number 7 because of the introduction of the new machine. So we need to divide the time horizon into 2 different phases because of these different investments. The first one in the product redesign and then the other one in the new machine. Moreover, the variation in the costs is related to 2 different elements. The first one is related to the additional units that the company needs to produce and sell. Given that 2,000 units should be produced in addition with respect to the quantity already produced, we have that we need to consider the additional costs related to the additional volume. So the first difference that we have is represented by the costs related to the additional volume. We have that the company needs to realize additional 2,000 units that should be multiplied by the unitary costs, where this unitary cost is 200 euros per unit, minus the savings which are related to the product redesign, which is 15 euros. If you remember, because of the product redesign, the company is able to save 15 euros each unit. So we need to take into account the unitary cost minus the savings. So this difference is the unitary cost for the additional product that are realized by the company. If we multiply the quantity that is produced by the unitary cost, we obtain 370, which represents the additional cost for the company. So basically the impact on the cash of this data is a minus because it represents a cash outflow. This is what happens with respect to the additional volume. But of course, given that the company saves 15 euros every unit that is realized, we need also to take into account the savings with respect to the existing production. So we have existent production, and with respect to the existing production, that is 4,000 units, we need to take into account the savings because of the lower costs. So basically, if we multiply the existing production by the 15 euros of savings, we can identify the savings because of the lower production cost. This value is of 60,000 euros. Given that this is a savings, the impact on the cash is positive, so we can consider this value in our schema with a plus. And this is what happens in the year number 1 and in the year number 2 because of this investment in product redesign. We need now to do the same calculations by considering the impact in the moment in which the new machine is introduced. We know that in the moment in which the new machine is introduced, the cost reduces by 30 euros per unit. So we can calculate again the savings in the volume, which are related to the fact that the company spends less with respect to the unitary production cost. So we will have the additional units that are produced, and their unitary value would be of 200 euros per unit minus these 15 euros of savings plus the 30 euros of additional savings. So we need to deduct 45, where this 45 is the 30 euros of saving because of the new machine and the 15 euros of savings because of the product redesign. So if we multiply the additional quantity by the lower production cost, we obtain 310,000 euros. That represents again the additional cost that the company needs to have in the moment in which wants to produce this additional quantity. At the same time, we need also to consider the savings with respect to the existing production. Again, we have the savings because the unitary production cost decreases with respect to our reference case. So still we will have 4,000 units that will be multiplied by the savings, where our savings will be 45 euros per unit. Why 45? Again, because we are considering the 30 euros of saving of the second investment, so the new machine, plus the 15 euros of investment because of the product redesign. So if we multiply the 4,000 units by 45 euros per unit, we obtain 180,000 euros. That again represents a saving, so we can consider this value with a plus because it positively impacts on the cash. We can now have all of the costs and all of the additional revenues with respect to the investment. If we sum all of the cash in and cash out that we have every year, we can now identify the overall variation in our cash. Once we have calculated the variation in the cash per each of our years, we can now finally apply our Npv formula. Our Npv formula is our standard formula, and we have 7 years in which we're going to calculate our investment, so we need to replicate this formula 7 times in order to calculate the discounted variation in the cash per each of the year that we are analyzing. In this case, we do not have any terminal value, so our formula will finish just with the net cash flow of each of the 7 years. Once we reach the end, we obtain an NPV of 3,883 euros, which is a positive value. This means that over a time horizon of 7 years, the company is able to generate an additional cash because of the investment of this amount of more or less 3,000 euros. This means that because of a positive value, the company has the convenience to accept the investment, which means both to invest in the product redesign and in the new machine.